Welcome to Fox Tales Folklore, where we explore new stories and tell old tales. We are building a community through the ancient art of storytelling. We share our stories, and we hope to inspire you to stand up, sing out, to find your voice. Our stories shape our world. Your story can change the world. Join the chorus and fall in love with the world again and all of its possibilities. Today we are here to celebrate all things fishy. And not just any fish, but my favorite fish, that is the salmon. When I was a kid, my father used to tell me that salmon or fish was brain food, and that if you eat more fish, you'll be a smarter person. Now, it might be because we did a lot of fishing, and fish was on the menu often, especially on a night that we went fishing. But then I found out as I got older that this is true. One of the genetic differences between Homo sapiens or humans and Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal is that Homo sapiens tended to live near rivers and to eat more fish. And there's something in the protein in fish that is similar to and helps to grow the protein in your brains. So maybe fish tales will help us to be a little smarter and maybe pay a little more attention to the fishes of the world. But again, my favorite fish is salmon. And this is not just any salmon, but it's an old Irish story, Finn McCool and the Salmon of Knowledge. Fain we ask Erin, faring o'er oceans, motions to mountains, fountains and bowers, showers, rills rushing, gushing waves swelling, swelling streams calling me home, swelling streams calling me home. Finn McCool was the greatest ruler that Ireland ever knew, and a poet too. Don't we wish that more of our rulers were poets? When Finn was a wee small lad, not yet whelped from his mother's breast, his father was killed in battle. He actually strapped himself to a stone to hold his position. But his mother was scared. Once his father was gone, they would come for Finn so they could claim the throne. And so Finn's mother made a very difficult choice. She sent her son away to hide out in the forest. She put him in the care of two elderly Druid women who kept him in an ancient oak tree. And these Druid women, they raised him upright. They were wise in the ways of the woods. They knew which fruits and berries were poisonous and which wild herbs were medicine. They also taught him the ways of sword and shield, for a woman could be a warrior in Druid times. And Finn, he grew up strong and straight. But when he was a young lad, and he felt he had learned all he could from these Druid women, they sent him to study with Finn Yeagus, the greatest poet that Ireland ever knew. Now, Finn Yeagus had two things that he loved. Poetry, of course, but the other was fishing. And there was one fish in particular that he sought, the fabled Salmon of Knowledge. As the old stories go, it is said that if you were the one to taste the first morsel of the Salmon of Knowledge, you would have knowledge of all things in this world and worlds beyond. You would have the gift of tongues, the gift of languages, of beast and bird, fish and fowl. Now, Finn Yeagus, he had hooked the Salmon of Knowledge, but it always snapped the line. Somehow it had always escaped. But one afternoon, as young Finn was lying by the streamside and watching the clouds move through the sky, with his two favorite hounds, Bran and Skule, laying beside him, Finn Yeagus was fishing in the River Boyne. And Finn Yeagus, he let out a shout. What joy, what rapture, my treasure I capture. Maybe not his best effort at poetry, but he finally landed the Salmon of Knowledge. He said to young Finn, I want you to skin this fish and I want you to roast it over a fire for me. But whatever you do, do not taste one morsel. It is only right that I, Finn Yeagus, the greatest poet that Ireland will ever know, that I have the gift of tongues and the wisdom from the fish of knowledge. Well, he went off to rest, and young Finn, he filleted that fish. First, he stoked up the fire, and then he found a large flat granite stone to put over the fire, so that while he was cleaning the fish, that stone was growing red hot. And then he made a special sauce with herbs and honey, herbs he had learned from the Druid women. And when he lay that fillet of salmon on top of that stone, he slathered it with this delicious sauce. And he watched it. And as it was cooking, there was a little bit of oil, a bit of fat under the skin. And that oil, it began to rise up. And soon there was a little bubble there. Young Finn McCool, he went to burst that bubble. The hot oil on his thumb. It was enough. As soon as he touched his thumb to his tongue, for a moment, he seemed to know all things in this world and the worlds beyond. The sky filled with clouds swimming overhead. And of course, in that moment, Finn Yeagus, the poet, came back to the fire. He took one look at young Finn and he knew, "You did it, didn't you? I told you not to taste it. The fish is mine, rightfully so. I caught it. But maybe it's right that you, young Finn McCool, someday you will be the greatest ruler that Ireland will ever know. Maybe it's only right that you have the gift of tongues, knowledge of all things in this world and the worlds beyond." Now, when Finn Yeagus said, "You did it," Finn was about to refute him, but when he touched his tongue with his thumb, he knew what Finn Yeagus was about to say. And so it was for many a year. Whenever Finn McCool was faced with a problem he couldn't solve, a question he couldn't answer, all he had to do was touch his thumb to his tongue, and somehow he knew. Fain we ask Erin, fair o'er oceans, motions to mountains, fountains and bowers, showers, rills rushing, gushing waves swelling, swelling streams calling me home, swelling streams calling me home. I do love that story. And that song is actually one of the oldest poems known in Ireland. And what I love about that poem, if you're listening carefully, the last word of each line rhymes with the first word of the next line. And that was a trick that the Irish bards, the Shanachie, the storytellers, would use to help them learn hundreds of stories. When I first became a storyteller, I had read somewhere to be a Shanachie, a traditional Irish storyteller, and yes, I am Irish, you had to learn 200 stories by heart. Not so much memorize, but to really take them in, and the stories become a part of you. And so I set the goal. I was going to learn 200 stories, and I would be a storyteller true. I stopped counting at 400 stories many years ago. The more you read, the more you know. You could learn these stories. You could tell a tale or two. What is your favorite fish? What is your favorite fish tale? Personally, I do love salmon. This next story is actually a story I learned from Johnny Moses. In the northwest coast of North America, the tribes that live along that coast live very densely because they have the greatest source of food that comes in from the ocean. All of those little rivers through Northern California and Oregon and Washington, up into Canada, all the way to Alaska. Not once, but depending on the stream and the species of salmon, they could have 2, 3, or even 4 or 5 species of salmon coming up spring, summer, and fall. And they would harvest those salmon. And they would smoke and roast them over a fire. Actually, if you've ever played that game, Fishy Fishy Swim Across the Sea, you could build your own fish weir in the midst of that game. I always do it. Where you catch a few people and build a wall so all the fish have to swim through one place in the game of tag. In the same fashion, they would put logs, sticks, in the river to build not an entire dam, but a fish weir. So all the fish had to swim through one place. And they could just stand there and net or spear fish after fish. And that way, in a few days, they could catch enough fish to feed their family for weeks. Salmon is a very important source of food for the people along the northwest coast, for the people of Ireland, for the people throughout the world, because salmon is a unique fish that spends part of its life in a freshwater stream, most of its life in the saltwater sea. But then at the end of its life, it comes back into those streams. They've also done the genetic test that salmon protein that helps to build brains, they have found that salmon protein in the bears and eagles, of course, because it's a major source of food. But when the bear or eagle carries the carcass up onto the shore, some of it gets into the soil, and they have found that protein in most of the life that lives in the northwestern forest. That gets into the soil and into the trees, into the huckleberries and blueberries. That salmon is a keystone species that feeds many of the species of the Northwest Territories. With all of that said, let me get to the story. This is the story of the Salmon Shaman that I learned from a traditional Nootka storyteller and friend of mine, Johnny Moses. Hendo hi hi hi, hendo hi hi hi, hendo hey, hendo hey, hendo hi hi hi, hendo hi hi hi, hendo hey, hendo hey, hendo hi, hendo hi, hendo hey, hendo hey, hendo hi, hendo hi, hendo hey, hendo hey. Many long years ago, there was a boy who loved to play down by the stream, near where the river entered the ocean, there in the delta along the coast. Now, his family would warn him, you must be careful. If you are playing in the stream and the whirlpools rise up, they will draw you out to sea and we will never know what became of you. Do not go down and play when the tide is going out or the tide is going in. Those riptides, they'll pull you away. Now, usually when your parents say, don't do that, they're speaking from some sense of knowledge or experience. But usually, in these kinds of stories, when a parent says, don't do that, guess what this young boy did? He was playing there near the coast, where the river enters the sea. And the river was raging with the spring floods. And the tide was going out. And as he was wading in the stream, he saw a salmon, a huge salmon, bigger than any salmon he had ever seen. And the boy thought, I'm going to catch a salmon. I'm going to feed the whole family. And he went down into the water. And just then, the tides rose up. And a whirlpool swirled around him. And the ocean sucked him in. He went down and down and down, deeper and deeper. But somehow, he could breathe. He didn't breathe air like you and I. It felt like somehow he was breathing water. And he looked out and he saw not hundreds but thousands of salmon. The salmon were migrating down out of the mountains, out of the rivers, out into the sea. And he looked around and everything felt slimy. His whole world was slimy. The fish, of course, were slimy, and he felt slimy. And he noticed that not only was he breathing water, But he had fins where he once had hands. He had a flipper, a tail where he once had legs. And he was speckled. He was salmon. And he swam down and down and down, deeper and deeper into the depths of the ocean. He moved through a huge school of fish. He followed the salmon as they swam north in their annual migrations from the coast up along the coast of Canada and Alaska out into the Bering Sea. And there was plenty to eat, sardines and eggs and of other fishes and just a multitude of foods. He with the other salmons fed and grew and fattened. And every year for several years, he made that migration from the California, Oregon, and Washington coast with millions of fish moving north, following the tides, following the hatchlings of eggs and the small fry and minnows, feasting, growing fatter. And year after year, when they came back south, some of the elders would swim up into the streams and they would disappear. And he knew that soon it would be his time, his turn. He followed his nose, the smells in the sea. He swam and he sensed that he was growing closer to not just any stream, not just any delta. This stream he smelled was his stream. And with this great school of fish, he migrated up into the rivers. He swam against the stream with 1,000 other salmon, leaping over waterfalls, swimming through the rapids, going back to where life began. He swam into a fish weir, and there were logs blocking his way. And he knew there was just a narrow passage. And as he entered that narrow passage, he knew somehow he was closer to home. Because standing there in that fish weir, as he leapt up over the dam to try to get to the upper pool, his father, with a huge net, scooped him up. And he thought, this is a strange fish. This does not look like other fish. This is a very ugly fish. It had the speckled spots, the bright colors and fins, but the fin on top, there was something about that fin. It looked almost like it had a copper-colored feather. That copper-colored feather, it reminded him, his son, who had disappeared years ago. He often wore a copper-colored feather tied in to a braid in his hair. He took this fish home to his wife, and she said, "Ew, that is an ugly fish. I cannot eat that fish." But almost as soon as those words tumbled from her lips, she too saw that fin that looked like a copper-colored feather. Oh no, this fish is our son. They went to the shaman, the medicine woman in the village, and the shaman took one look at this fish and knew it was their son. She instructed them to close him up for 4 days and 4 nights, to anoint his body with oils as he made the transition from fish to human once more. And every day they sang over him, "Hendo hi hi hi, hendo hi hi hi, hendo hey, hendo hey, hendo hi hi hi, hendo hi hi hi, hendo hey, hendo hey." And at the end of 4 days, he was no longer a fish. He was a man. And that young man, he, from that day forward, was known as a Salmon Shaman. He knew of this world and the watery world below. He could speak with the salmon. He knew when the salmon would be returning, and he would help the fishermen to prepare their nets and their weirs. He knew where those fish had come from, because he had been there himself. And from that day forward, the village never went hungry again. And he lived many long years, helping the people to deepen their respect for that wet and watery world, and their brothers and sisters who swam from the sea into their stream to feed and provide for them. But one day, when he was an old man, he saw some boys playing down by the delta where the river enters the sea. And he warned them, "You must be careful. There are whirlpools that will swallow you under." And as he was scolding them, a whirlpool rose up and took him away. And he was drawn back to the sea, where he lived for many more long years. The Salmon Shaman from the Nootka tribe of the Northwest Coast. This next story is not a traditional folk tale like the others I've been telling. This is a true story written by my good friend Garth Gilchrist. It's called The Salmon Stream. Right now, imagine that you're high in the Cascade Mountains of Washington or Oregon. Imagine that there's this shadowy little stream, huge Doug fir and pine trees growing over it, Sitka spruce. And if you come down those trees into the stream itself, just a narrow little gurgle of water, sandy at the bottom, a few rocks. Under the sand is a pink little egg, reddish pink. And inside that egg, sleeping through the long winter, has been the fry. But it's been growing. Its body has absorbed the yolk, and the fish now fills that skin-encased egg. And the fish begins to wiggle and squirm, and it bursts open. And the fish begins to swim about. There's not a lot of current there in this pool, high at the mountain, but that little bit of current brings tiny microscopic insects, zooplankton, phytoplankton, and the fish feeds on those. It's such a tiny little minnow. But days become weeks, and the small fry begins to slowly grow, eating little bits of plant matter and leaves. And there's a voice inside the fish that says, "Stay, stay." Now, cutthroat trout comes into the stream, and the little minnow, it swims in behind a root to hide, and the cutthroat swims on by. A bird, a belted kingfisher, comes swooping down and dives in and catches another minnow, but our friend is hiding behind that root, there in that small pool, high in mountain stream. And the voice whispers, "Stay, stay." And it stays through a long season. But as summer changes towards autumn, that little minnow, now a bit bigger, hears a new voice. And the voice says, "Follow the current, move with the stream." And it begins to move downstream. And from a little trickle, there's rushing waves. And it follows the stream, and the voice grows louder. Move, move, splashing over waterfalls into a pool down below. It swims downstream, and other streams join the stream. And from that little trickle, there's now rolling waves and crashing whirlpools over rocks and waterfalls. Swim, swim hard. And the little fish hears crashing waves, booming. "Swim, swim," the voice says, and it swims out. And all is salty, sand crashing. The little fish swims through the wall of sand and surf out into the deep sea, where the pool has no sides or no bottom. And it joins thousands, millions of other fish, and they swim out into the ocean, They follow the ocean currents. There are small herring for them to eat. And the voice says, stay close, stay close. And she swims into a huge school of salmon. And just then, an orca comes splashing through and captures several in a mouthful. But she swims aside. She stays in the middle. A sea lion comes rushing up from the bottom and grabs another fish right beside her. But she stays in the middle and swims north. 2 years pass, and she lives in this bottomless sea, eating the eggs of smaller fish, eating small herring and jellyfish. But then her body changes, and the voice changes. Go back, go back. And she follows the school of fish as they swim along the shore. There are other streams, and some of the fish leave to go into those streams. Not yet, the voice says. And then she smells her stream like a shock wave. She turns and goes up into this stream. The voice says, swim hard, and she swims through the wall of surf and sand and into the wide river. She follows the smell. The voice says, swim hard. She leaps up over those waterfalls she had descended earlier. And then, the smell, the small pool, and another dream. A male fish comes up beside her. She wags her tail in the shallow sand and she digs a small nest. Eggs that she has been carrying from the sea, she squirts from her body. The male swims in close and he spreads his seed and the eggs are fertilized. She comes back around and once more waves her tail and buries the eggs in sand. And now the voice says, rest, rest, drift. And she listens to the voice as she begins to drift downstream. And all is quiet. She no longer hears the voice. And out of the sky, a bald eagle comes swooping down and snatches her up, carries her to a treetop, and devours what's left of her. Her life feeds the eagle. Her bones and scraps feed the roots of the trees. Part of what was salmon spreads throughout the forest. And those eggs, resting under the sand, mean that her story will begin yet again. So what are your favorite fish? Do you like to eat fish? How do you like it cooked? Where do you get your fish? If we learn about where these fishes come from and we harvest more sustainably, there will always be fish. But if we're not careful, some of our fisheries are beginning to disappear. Best thing you can do is go down to your local stream or pond or river and catch your own fish. Then you know where it comes from and you know it's sustainably harvested. You could also do a study about what fish eats and learn about the life of a fish and maybe write your own biography of a bass or the autobiography of a catfish. I think there's another episode with a song that I wrote from the point of view of a catfish. You could write your own stories that are based on the science, nonfiction, story from a fish's point of view, like the story you just heard. Send those stories to me, because I'd love to see them. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Fox Tales Folklore. Next time, invite your friends. And maybe you can send us a link to you telling one of your favorite folk tales, and we'll use it on an upcoming episode. Join our choir to fall in love with the world and all of its possibilities.